Good evening. This is a video I wanted to share that is my thoughts on what I think people need to know to be able to understand what's going to unfold at the upcoming General Conference of the United Methodist Church. It's coming at the end of April, April 23rd to May 3rd. And so I'm going to want to be able to take a few moments to go over some history, some church structure, and at the end I'll give you a few of my thoughts on what might happen, maybe even a thought about what should happen. But up until then, this is mostly kind of a just the facts, ma'am type of just here's the context you need to understand. I think the first thing to understand is that the history matters, that the Methodist Church has a history that is full of church splits, that since the 1784 Christmas conference that formed the Methodist Church in America, the church has split many, many times. Assembly of God, Pentecostal, Nazarene, they're all Methodists who left at some point. AME, AMEZ, CME, Salvation Army, they're all Methodists. They're all in the Wesleyan family of churches. And so if it is really unique that since 1968, when the United Methodist Church formed, that there really hasn't been a church split. It's the longest that a Wesleyan church has gone, the main branch of the Wesleyan Methodist tradition in America has gone without splitting. So that there has finally been another church split in this time frame with the GMC, the Global Methodist Church. That's kind of a return to form. So let's get into some details about the specific one set of mergers, splits and mergers, I think that are important to help us understand today. In 1939, the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South came together and joined up again. In 1844, the church split. The Methodist Church in America split. So 1844 to 1939, there was the Methodist Church South, the Methodist Church, which was the Methodist Church North. And so in 1939, that merger happened. And then in 1968, the merger happened between the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren, EUB. And you can think, that's where you get the United of United Methodist. And that's where you can think of the EUB as a different culture and some sort of German Methodists, you might think of them. So go look up a Wesleyan family tree just on Google and you'll see a lot of branches. The way the Methodist Church runs itself is that every church has a yearly meeting called a charge conference. And then at that meeting, that charge conference, which is the only gathering that can speak for a church. I don't speak for the Shelbina Methodist Church or any other Methodist church. It's only the charge conference that can officially, legally, and bindingly speak for a church. And every charge conference sends a delegate, two delegates, a pastor and a layperson, off to an annual conference, which usually is a geographic grouping of churches. And that annual conference, which meets annually, decides who is ordained, where pastors are going to go. A bishop is over an annual conference. Those churches do ministry together. They tend to line up with state lines, but that's not always the case. Missouri used to be Missouri East and West, and before that it was Missouri North, Central, and South, and North had Kansas City, Central had St. Louis, and I don't know what major city South had. Go further back than that, and there was a German Methodist conference in Missouri. And so it's not always a geographic gathering, a distinction that will become very important in just a moment. So charge conference, church, annual conference, a gathering of churches that are have representatives from each individual congregation. And then, so charge, annual, and then the annual conference sends people off to general conference. Missouri sends 12, is my understanding. 12 people to general conference. There are somewhere between 600 and 1,000 delegates to General Conference. It varies by year. This year there'll be 864 in the 2024 General Conference, I believe. And General Conference is just like with annual conference, it's a 50-50 split between lay people and clergy, which in many ways has kept the Methodist tradition stable. The pastors can't get ahead of the lay people in the congregation. Like, we've got to move together. I think that's healthy. I think that's a good thing. The General Conference is not just America, though. It includes Korean Methodists and Kenyan Methodists and German Methodists and Russian Methodists and Ukrainian Methodists and Methodists from all over the world. Not British or South Africa. They are their own Methodist churches, but yeah. So this is where we got to go back to that 1939 merger. It left two distinct scars. So, as I said, annual conferences are the gathering of churches in a geographic area. The Missouri Annual Conference, the West North Carolina Annual Conference, Florida has an annual conference, right? When the North and the South got back together, they split in 1844, they got back together in 1939. They couldn't get together cleanly. And the two costs of bringing the North and the South together were jurisdictions and the Central Conference. First, jurisdictions. The jurisdictions are slices of America. It's Northeast, Southeast, North Central, South Central, and West. And it's a way to keep bishops in an area. And so Alabama didn't want some wingnut liberal California bishop, and New York didn't want some conservative Mississippi bishop. And so the jurisdiction is the area out of which bishops are elected and bishops are assigned. And that way, they come out of that merger in 1939, and it was a statement of how much we don't trust each other's leadership. It's kind of depressing. Missouri is the northernmost tip of the South Central jurisdiction, and like the way that has played out is Texas, if I remember correctly, has 4 annual conferences because Texas is big, and so it had more pull on what bishops were elected, and so Texas has dominated the bishops of the South Central jurisdiction for decades now. And then Southeast, Northeast, North Central, West, like your bishop has a lot of authority, and that was one way to just control and institutionalize our distrust of leaderships from other part of the country. The other thing that happened out of that 1939 merger between North and South was the creation of what was called a Central Conference. It was a racial conference. Every Black Methodist church in the country was part of that Central Conference. And so St. Luke's in downtown Columbia, there's a Black Methodist church in Marshall, Hannibal, other places around the state of Missouri. They were all in the same annual conference as Black Methodist churches in Florida, in New York, in California. And so like when they would get together for their annual conference meeting, it was a bit of a drive, kind of a hassle. And so all those Black Methodist churches, like the North and South could get together, but the South couldn't bear to integrate those Black Methodist churches into their geographic conferences, into Mississippi and Alabama. And in fact, if you go back into the history of Southern Methodism, when it was split from 1844 to 1939 into North and South, the South actually spun off as many of the Methodist churches that were Black that they could and formed the CME. At the time, it was the Colored Methodist Episcopal. Now it's the Christian Methodist Episcopal. If you ever find one, that's where it came from. You're only going to find them in the South, but Colored Methodist Episcopal is as many of the Black Methodist churches that the Southern Methodist Church could spin off as they could in the years between 1844 and 1939. And so, okay, 1939, the North and South come together. they can't come together clean. They form the jurisdictions because we can't trust each other's leadership, and they form the Central Conference because the Black Methodist churches, they can be part of the Methodist Church, but they've got to be by themselves. 1968, we got rid of the Central Conference. When the United Methodist Church is formed in 1968, we got rid of the Central Conference, and so St. Luke's in downtown Columbia is now part of the Missouri Conference, the geographic conference it's located in. We kept the jurisdictions. Kind of a shame, really. But that's kind of how history unfolded. So what do we do? So the General Conference is the worldwide gathering. That annual conference is the geographic, Missouri, North Carolina, Mississippi, etc., send delegates to put together what's called the Book of Discipline, which is the governance, the book. If you have a Book of Discipline, a Bible, and a hymnal, you can run a Methodist church. Like, that's what you have to have. And so the General Conference meets every 4 years, has delegations from the geographic areas. It writes the Book of Discipline. It cannot touch Wesley sermons, articles of religion, confession of faith, general rules. It can't touch those, but it can change the rest. Okay, what about the delegates from overseas? As United Methodism spread, Methodism and then United Methodism spread into Africa, Korea, and Europe, those areas, they're called Central Conferences. So that term, from 1939 to 1968, a Central Conference, there was one of them, and it was the Racial Central Conference in America. And then from 1968 on, we use the same term, but it means something very different. A Central Conference is like Germany, or a chunk of Africa, or Korea. And the reason we call them something other than an annual conference is because they have a different relationship to the General Conference. Let me explain. When the General Conference puts together its Book of Discipline, it'll put together, this is how, for example, the American Methodist churches will handle their retirement. Like at General Conference 2024, we need to modify our retirement system for long-term stability. Like, that's a good thing. We need to attend to our retirement system. Why is the German Methodist part of that discussion? Well, they're part of the Worldwide Methodist Church. But they take the Book of Discipline back to Germany, and they're not going to implement an American-style retirement system in Germany, which has a different economic structure. And so all of the Central Conferences are empowered to modify the Book of Discipline to fit their context, other than they can't touch Wesley sermons, articles of religion, etc., those core documents, but they can modify the rest. And so Africa, like, it kind of gets at some of the weirdness of the system. Like a Kenyan Methodist will come to America and vote and discuss in a language they don't speak about a pension they won't get. And then they'll take the Book of Discipline back to Kenya, and then they will modify it to fit their context. And they'll say, we don't have a pension program. I mean, we definitely don't have that style pension program. And so the Central Conferences are empowered to modify to fit their context, and that includes ordination, that includes marriage, that includes how money is used. Like, it's all up for grabs. You find the method that fits that context. Okay, so African delegates. Let's talk about African delegates. The Central Conferences have been making up more and more of the percentage of the total number of delegates for years. In 2008, the Central Conferences made up 28% of the delegates. In 2019, Central Conferences being all of the conferences overseas, they made up 43% of the delegates. And so that voting block of Central Conference delegates, Southeast and South Central, have had the sway to vote for what they want coming out of General Conference. And that number of people coming from the Central Conference is overseas, predominantly Africa, continues to grow. And I am very glad that Methodism is growing in Africa. That's wonderful. That's great. Africa is a different place than America. LGBT questions, which is the driving factor here in some ways, are not in the same place there as in here. In America, there's interesting discussions happening there. In Africa, and there are multiple countries in Africa where just to stand up and say, I'm a practicing gay man, would be a chargeable offense that could lead to the death penalty. And that would be a given. Like, it's just a different discussion. And so when they take our book of discipline back over there, they modify it. And the question over there is one of polygamy. I was talking to a person who was at General Conference who was telling me about getting on an elevator with a delegate from Africa who started talking about, polygamy. It's not so bad. It works well for me. And the guy from America, he was telling me that he was thinking, like, what conversation did I just end up in? Someone's telling me about the advantages of polygamy? Like, that's not the discussion that he ever expected to be in. It's a different culture, different context, different methods are needed. And what's weird is, like, in Africa, things don't split in the same way. In America, if I told you my stance on abortion was this, you would probably be able to extrapolate a stance on gun control / gun rights, on political party affiliation, on local control, government. I mean, you could there's a lot of things that go together. Those things don't go together in the same way in Africa. And so in Africa, there is a far more the words conservative, liberal, progressive all get very wonky on this. So I use these hesitantly, but there's a far more conservative stance on sexuality in Africa. But that doesn't mean that those churches don't want to be part of the United Methodist Church, because there's a real power in being part of a worldwide tradition and denomination. There's a legitimacy there that matters a lot. And so, yes, that voting bloc holds together on certain issues, but it will not on others. Also, 90-odd% of the funding for global Methodist events, global Methodist emergency response, global Methodist ministry, 90-odd%, last number I saw was 99.4% of the funding for that comes from America. And up until 2019, 55 to 57% of the delegates in the General Conference are from America. In the next couple of years, that's going to flip. And 55% of the delegates are not going to be from America when 99% of the money is coming from America. And that's going to get real interesting when folks who are not from America are voting for how to spend the money. Like, this is part of, there are some shifts that need to happen in how the church governance functions. And so I'm going to tell you what I hope happens in just a moment. Part of my hopes. So in 2019, there was a special session of General Conference in St. Louis. And there were two plans that were looked at. One was called the One Church Plan, which was to say that, in broad strokes, every annual conference would decide who would be ordained, and then local churches would decide questions of who would be married in that congregation. And sort of just take the topic of sexuality, we're just not going to argue about it anymore. That was the One Church Plan. It was up for discussion at General Conference in 2019 in St. Louis. The other plan was called the Traditional Plan, and it was my understanding of it that was kind of a ratcheting down and in making it far more clear that if a practicing professed gay man or lesbian woman, that those people have not been ordained in the Methodist Church, openly ordained in the Methodist Church for a while, for decades now. But the Traditional Plan was kind of ratcheting it down and making it more clear that it was. And what happened was after 2019, that traditional plan, it came off as mean. And I was on the floor of General Conference when I was on the floor. I was in the balcony watching. Only delegates were on the floor. I watched that vote happen, and it passed by like 20 votes, 30 votes. I don't remember the exact number, but when you're watching 860 delegates and something passes by a handful of votes, like just shy of half the people are crushed, and some of them are weeping, feeling that they're being cast out from their church. And some other people were singing hymns, and it was painful. Really hard to watch, to be in the room with that. And there was a response, and a lot of American Methodism, a lot of the annual conferences, including the Missouri one, the people who were moderate and progressive came together. Like previously, people on the conservative side had sort of approached one way, liberal side approached the other way, and moderates, I don't really think they had not sort of stepped in. That's my take on it. In 2019, that had come off as so just mean the way it was put together, that a lot of those moderates kind of said, we'll work with progressives here, and slates of delegates at annual conference. So annual conference chooses who will go to the next general conference. The statewide gathering chooses who will go to the worldwide gathering general conference. And there were a lot of states in America that put together slates of moderate to progressive folk that to go to general conference. And so it is a very weird moment where the number of delegates coming from overseas is going up. The number of delegates who are moderate to progressive in America is going up. And so there are a lot of trends at play here. And it's really hard to pin down how this is going to unfold. Like I don't know. And I'm trying to follow it. And a lot at play here. And so, okay, General Conference 2019. The traditional plan is approved. And the assumption in the moment was that the churches who were going to leave would be the churches that were liberal. And there was a process put in place that would last until the end of 2023, by which churches, all these liberal churches who were going to leave, could leave by paying a chunk of money to make sure that the retirement program stayed stable. Because if like Shelbina Methodist Church left the Methodist Church today, its previous pastors still have a legally binding claim on the United Methodist Church for their retirements. And so the church has to pay a chunk of money to reinforce the retirement system so that the other churches in the area don't have to pick up that slack. And so there was a lump sum payment that was needed to leave. And the assumption was there'd be liberal churches that were leaving. And a few did, but for the most part, it's been interesting to watch because it hasn't been liberal churches leaving. It's been conservative churches who saw that the annual conferences reacting to the perceived meanness of the traditional plan, they started leaving. And it's been very weird to watch because the way that the disaffiliation is what it's called, and I'm glossing over some details there, I know. The disaffiliation process was set up. You had to say, I disagree with the stance of the Methodist Church on sexuality to be able to use that process. And all these churches have left because they're more conservative. The stance of the Methodist Church with regards to sexuality, as of right now, is the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian doctrine. Like that is the stance of the church. And so these churches that have left because they disagree with the church, well, I just told you the official position of the church. So it was weird, but ended up being a lot of conservative churches that left to go form to be part of the GMC, which I'm just gonna have a hard time not thinking of a truck when I say GMC. It still comes to mind. Okay, so with that process of disaffiliation, 25% of the churches in the country disaffiliated. 50% of the churches in the Southeast disaffiliated, in the Southeast part of the country. In Missouri, we lost 20%. We dropped down to 550 churches. 550 churches in a state is still a lot of churches. Missouri has weathered this storm not without pain or hurt. Missouri seems to be weathering this storm well. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about the nature of how Methodism functions as a culture, right? We are practical before we're dogmatic. If you want a church that is like consistent and coherent all the way down, go be Catholic, right? That's what they strive to be. Or there are other traditions that just like consistent all the way down. And Methodism, as you know, like it's built into our system that those central conferences are going to go take the Book of Discipline and change it to work in their area because that's the method that's needed. Methodism is not a completely consistent and coherent church all the way down. We're just not. We're a church that's focused on the methods of following Jesus. We're going to follow Jesus and we're going to argue about how to do it. That's okay. I hope that Methodism continues to be a strong force in American culture, and especially in rural America, because there are many places where the Methodist Church is one of the only places where women are ordained, one of the only churches in which women are ordained. And I think it is really important for little girls to see women in leadership. I think that's really important. So Methodism ends up being a big tent church. And in many ways, the question for individual Methodists and individual churches is not what do I believe about sexuality? The question is, can I be in a church where others disagree with me about sexuality? And that's a different question. Okay, what's going to happen at General Conference? In 2019, at that General Conference, the Bishop of Missouri sat between the Bishop of Russia and the Bishop of Germany. And the Bishop of Russia said, if the Methodist Church changes its stance on sexuality, Putin will destroy the church. And the Bishop of Germany said, if the church doesn't change its stance on sexuality, we're going to run slam into EU laws, culture. Those aren't exact quotes, but that was how it was presented to me at General Conference. And so there is a real pressure for something to change. What could change? I think one thing that could change is to repeal the language throughout the Book of Discipline that mentions sexuality and become neutral, and to devolve that authority down to annual conferences. So the annual conferences decide who to ordain, and local churches decide about what type of marriages can occur in their buildings. I think that is entirely likely. It's effectively the one church plan that had been discussed back in 2019. The second major option that could happen is that America could be a central conference. And I think this is utterly essential. It's less likely, but I think it's really important. Because right now, the General Conference is a place for Americans to get together and argue out our American topics while people from other nations show up. And it's not a healthy setup. And in the next decade, it's going to become an African-centric gathering. And that is no more healthy than it has been to be an American-centric gathering. I think that it is far healthier for the General Conference to be a place where we discuss what binds us together as Wesleyan followers of Jesus, and then let the central conferences, the individual areas, America, Europe, Africa, sit down and work out how is that going to work out in our context. It makes sense to me. That will require some constitutional changes, which are possible but challenging. The third option, and this is the depressing one, is gridlock. It could be that nothing happens at General Conference. Nothing major. Like, things will happen, but it could be that just no major reforms are made, and that would be a problem. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what happens. Back in the General Conference in 2012, someone put forward the statement, can we agree that we disagree about sexuality? Right? And we couldn't even agree that we disagreed about sexuality. It was depressing in some ways. So I don't think we look to General Conference to solve our problems. I think the problems of Methodism are solved at the local congregation as people take seriously following Jesus. And just because General Conference decides something does not mean that's what's going to happen. Like, let me be clear about that. In Methodist history, like, women weren't allowed to be General Conference delegates. And then 1888, 5 of them were elected because annual conferences are going to do what annual conferences are going to do. Women can't preach in the Methodist history back in the 19th century, but in 1889, Kansas ordained Eugenia and said, we're ordaining her. And that's it. Like, the rest of it was against General Conference. The other conferences, annual conferences, would not ordain women. Kansas did. Okay? From 1884 on, in the Methodist Episcopal Church South, North and South, you could not preside over the wedding of someone who'd been divorced, except pastors did. It was, you could not smoke and be a Methodist pastor for decades. But people did. And sometimes the Methodist bishop who was ordaining people would ask them, like, the questions about ordination while smoking a cigar, which included, are you going to smoke? And people would say no to a bishop who was obviously smoking in front of them, right? So just because General Conference says it, that doesn't mean that's always going to be how it exactly unfolds. I mean, and we know that because the speed limit is 65 and no one ever goes above 65, right? Like, the speed limit is what's enforced. It's not necessarily always what's on the sign. So that's what I think people need to understand about history, structure, polity, that, like, when it comes to handling problems, we stumble forward. We tend to stumble through, like dealing with the race stuff in the 20th century. Like, it's not like we got it right and that was that. Like, we formed a central conference before we finally got that worked out a little bit better. Like, Methodism is not going to, like, go to General Conference in 2024 and get it all right. Hopefully we get a step forward. I hope we do. I'm going to go there to watch because I think it matters. I think it's important, but it's not going to be a vacation. It's going to be hard. So, 2 questions for you. First, do you have any questions about this presentation? Feel free to text, email, etc. Let me know. Second, I have obviously not discussed the presenting issue of LGBT people who faithfully follow Jesus. I'm perfectly willing to talk about where I land on that, how I got there, scripture, tradition, reason, experience. Like, I will talk about that with anyone. I have preferred to do that one-on-one, and I don't know if I'm going to have that luxury this year. It may be I need to talk about that in small groups. I may need to preach about it. I don't want to, but I might need to, and if I need to, I will. So tell me what I should do about that too, what your opinion is about how I should handle that. Thank you for your time, and if you're still watching, God love you, and have a good night.